Annie, welcome back. And Ian, thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to continue our conversation about your career and military medical research that matters for people on the battlefield and at home. So let's talk about the University of Colorado Center for Combat Research. When we last left you in your life course, you were not at the University of Colorado. You were a portfolio manager for the Department of Defense. So how did you come to the Combat Center, and what do you do?
I was looking for a change professionally, was looking to grow in a way that I was not receiving at the time, and so was just looking for that next professional step. I will also say, since we already brought my spouse up, I had recently been married and was trying to find that work-life balance that Spiro talked about, and that kind of like that golden balance of how do I manage all of this workload. The being on the funding sponsor side, I will say, is quite a substantial amount of work. And now newly married, I wanted to have more time, right? And so trying to find something that was a little bit more professionally fulfilling and would allow me a growth trajectory that I didn't see. And then back to our buzzword of network, I had the opportunity and the privilege to have a steering committee of service members when I was working for the DoD to fill in the holes, right? And to tell me what I didn't know about providing clinical care as I was trying to decide what the research objectives should be for the upcoming years. I was fortunate enough to cross paths with Vic Robarda, then I think he was Lieutenant Colonel then, Vic Robarda, who was an Air Force researcher, emergency medicine doctor, was active duty at the time. And then moving forward, when I was looking for a change, he had recently come to the University of Colorado and had started the Center for Combat Research and was trying to grow it. It was very small. There was one full-time employee at the time, and then a couple other folks who were, just giving as much time as they could. And so they were in startup phase, and we talked a lot about what that could look like and what I could do. And I do think my former boss gave me a good word with Vic, and so we talked it through. I thought I was moving to Colorado Springs at the time. The Army said, "Just kidding, you're moving to North Carolina." And Vic said, "I don't care. Come work for me remotely." And so that's how I landed at Center for Combat at CU.
Nice. So one of the things that you have in your role at the center is this depth of experience from the sponsor side. And then I know from other sort of focus areas, part of what you're doing is trying to keep the network alive and find talented researchers who might have a role, a collaborative role or a leadership role in research in military medicine space. So we might refer to them as future combat investigators. So if other people out in the world listening to this are thinking, there's probably a way that my work could be focused on military health as well, how are the most successful engagements with you? What do people say to you when they reach out? What are they prepared with? How can we advise? Ian, you didn't really have this because you went into your training where there was a baked in thing, but nevertheless, let's help the mentees possibly think through how would we prepare them.
We get a lot of emails like that. And so it's a breadth. And I will say that the folks that we tend to engage with and see the potential there are the folks who, they don't come to us and say, "Hey, I heard DoD has funding in this area." Or they don't come to us and say, "This is what I really, really want to do. How can the DoD fund it?" They are passionate about military service members and their problems. They're passionate about the beneficiaries. They're passionate about the community of military service members. And so the first thing that we always talk about is, what is your deliverable? what are you ultimately trying to achieve for the service member? And so I think that's what really forces folks who are more NIH oriented to think about their research. And we've talked about this. I think it's a common thread that we've had with our other speakers or invited guests to the Mentors Desk. And it's the DoD is very deliverable oriented. They require a transition plan. They require identification of what your outcome is, and not outcome in the research sense of, decreased PHQ-9 score or increased, whichever one's better, I apologize. But, not an improvement in a clinical measure. That's not the outcome we're talking about. We're talking about, are you impacting mortality? Are you impacting quality of life? Are you impacting policy readiness? That's what the military is there for. And so...
Well, this is wonderful. I need to ask a couple of things. One, we're NIH investigators. We have to write about deliverables. How are NIH deliverables different than the deliverables you're thinking of?
And maybe too, if you could define what we even mean by a deliverable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you'll allow me a little side road.
Please.
So within the Department of Defense, research is an acquisition. So meaning that they look at it as they are buying something. So ultimately, they need to have something that is tangible for the cost of that research.
So would we, in NIH terms, would we say we might think of it as a grant, but they think of it as a contract, right? It's work for an outcome?
In sense, yes. But ultimately, the goal is for your research to either produce as a deliverable what they call a knowledge product. So are you changing clinical practice guidelines? Are you changing a policy? Are you changing doctrine? Are you changing a training curriculum? So something that's not tangible in the sense of here's your medical device or here's your pharmacologic, but it's something that will impact knowledge. And the other side of that coin is the material product. So that's the other deliverable. It's either knowledge product or material. And the material is the medical device. It's the pharmacologic, the therapeutic, the apps, software, things like that.
So if I could just reflect on what you just said as a knowledge product, that's definitely not a publication.
No.
Right?
No.
That is like 17 years later, right? I mean, that's like many steps beyond a publication,
Yes.
right? So, how do you help people who are not used to that advance, accelerate?
It's a flip of the mindset. And so even when I was within the DoD, trying to get the intramural laboratories to understand that as well, right? A manuscript is not a deliverable. JAMA is great. New England Journal is great. Science is fantastic. But what comes after that?
Yeah, what else?
Yeah. And so that's why we think of it as an acquisition, because there has to be something to implement.
You know what? It's fascinating because some of this, besides being totally new to me, but some of this, on the NIH side, I think the agencies have moved beyond pubs and presentations, like blah, blah. We need a dissemination plan, right? You never really used to say much about that except what paper you would write. But now, and especially foundation funders, they want to hear more. Publishing and, passively letting people find your stuff isn't good enough. And I will say, I think, at least in the circles I've been in, a lot of the dissemination plan more broadly is really just informing people. So it's social media, might be a public campaign, maybe a marketing campaign, but it's still sort of just awareness and education, loosely defined. It's just in non-traditional outlet, non-academic outlets. And yet I've never heard it insist that it includes actual practice change or policy change. So it absolutely has expanded, but not to an overlapping extent. That's very helpful, actually.
I think it's that big difference of reframing your research trajectory. And I don't recall who we spoke to about this. We talked about it last night. But biting off those small chunks of research that you can accomplish, but ultimately understanding what the end goal is. And so, you're not going to go from molecule discovery to vaccine production and at full FDA approval in a single grant. It is a multi-grant, multi-year, sometimes decade process. But you need to have that vision even when you're applying for the molecule identification stage. You need to know why you're saying, I'm identifying a therapeutic target. Okay, great. How's that going to help the military? And so you need to lay that out at the beginning, at the onset.
Well, this harkens back to you sort of starting with those users in mind to help you bridge, like keep talking with me, tell me if I knew this, what if I knew this, what if I knew this, like help me connect the dots, because I would imagine that's not always totally obvious.
Yeah, I think it's, and Annie's helped me a lot with this and thinking through how to approach this, but it's figuring out what is the solution and often going from there versus I think a lot of times researchers are trained to think like what interests you and then go from there.
Perfect segue to what I feel is the ultimate difference that we would tell someone who wants to be a military relevant researcher. NIH is more investigator driven, investigator initiated research. What's your passion? What's your vision? What do you want to do? DoD is requirements driven, meaning that there is an exceptionally long, extremely bureaucratic process for identifying a capital R requirement, which means the military has a gap, in this case, a medical gap. How are we going to solve it? And someone in that military cog has said, research in X will help us solve this requirement. And you have to identify that and you have to align to that. And if you don't, or if they don't believe you, you don't get funded. And so to Ian's point, the military collaborators can help you understand that gap and how to approach it. Even if you might not really fit, they might say, change this one thing, and then this is perfectly aligned. And so it's understanding that you can adapt what you ultimately thought you wanted to do into something that is going to drive change, and it's going to result in deliverables and practice change, and I don't know. So it's just a reframing. Yeah.
You mentioned two transition plans.
Oh, thank you.
Tell us what that is.
Sure. I will not talk ad nauseum because it's very dry and boring. But so very basic, very, very important. But so basically within the DoD funding pipeline, there is earlier research, which is called science and technology. And it's basic research, discovery, applied research. And then you kind of hit this valley of death where you are probably in that like FDA phase 2 stage, and it transitions to another funding sponsor. So it's still DoD, but it's what they call advanced development. And so what we would focus on in the transition plan and what that is, it's how do you get from science and technology to advanced development? Because after advanced development, it's acquisition, it's procurement. So that's when the DoD is like, yeah, we're gonna buy that. And so how are you transitioning through those 3 stages? And so for our drug development colleagues, for our assay development, our technology, medical device development colleagues, that is very centered on the FDA regulatory pathway. How do you meet those milestones? How do you achieve your IND, your IDE, all of those steps? And you have to explain your plan. And if you don't have one, you have to say that up front and say, I will have one. And so sometimes part of your grant is to develop a regulatory strategy, and that's totally okay. They just need to know you're thinking about it. And on the knowledge product side, you're not necessarily transitioning to advanced development because they're on the FDA side. So they're looking at material solutions. But what you have to do is explain how you're going to transition the knowledge product and implement it to impact change. And so one of the things we often use for our investigators, Adit is a perfect example of this. So Adit Ginde, clinical trialist, very impactful with his research. And so when we do his transition plans, we're focusing on what groups within the military need to hear your results? How do they need to hear them in order to implement change either in their local organization or writ large within the Army, within the Navy, within the Air Force, Space Force? And so that's the knowledge product transition plan. It's who do I have to disseminate to? How do I help them implement? What other, God, I'm going to use the acronym .MILPF, doctrine, organization, training, leadership, policy, material. It is how it is how the DoD changes things, basically. And so you cannot implement a research outcome in isolation. And so you have to think about, how does this affect training? Who's going to train when I say you need to do XYZ in your clinical practice? Do I have the organizational structure in place for that? Do I need more RTs? Respiratory therapists? Do I need more critical care docs? Do I need more nurses if I'm going to implement this change? And so it is thinking, to your point, transition plans, thinking about all of those things and who do you have to help to implement it.
So a transition plan is so central to a good transition plan is so central to a good grant that you submit to the DoD. And I can imagine for a novice researcher, I experienced it. It's terrifying and overwhelming. What advice would you give to a novice researcher who's like, oh, I want to pursue DoD, and then they hear, oh my God, but I've never done a transition plan. What does that mean? What would you say? My
first thought would be find someone within the DoD, it doesn't have to be an active duty person, it can be a civilian, who is in your space. And talk to them, collaborate with them.
In your content area?
In your content area, thank you. I will say that not everyone is great at writing transition plans, regardless of where they are, civilian, military, what have you. But finding someone who can help mentor you in what that means is quintessential, I think. If you don't understand what a deliverable is for the DoD, you're never going to understand the transition plan. And so there's a lot of materials out there within the DoD on knowledge products. They have knowledge readiness guidelines, they have technology readiness guidelines, and what that means. And so educate yourself would be my first comment.
And those are publicly available, so people could study up on those. Okay.
Yeah. Can you guess who taught me how to write a transition plan?
I had a lot of experience writing them in the DoD. Yeah.
This is so helpful. Thank you so much. Is there any final words of wisdom or invitation that you want to give to our listeners before we wrap up?
The only final, I don't think I'll call it word of wisdom, but reflection I have is, it is intimidating if you've never done DoD research before, specifically thinking about what we would refer to as the core DoD funding. So Combat Casualty Care Research Program, Military Operational Medicine Research Program, and Military Infectious Disease Research Program. It's very intimidating. Get over it, I think. You're going to be afraid, and that's okay, and you're going to fail, and that's okay too. And just keep trying and keep expanding your network and keep finding the holes and plug them with collaborators and people who know more than you do. And ultimately, it's a process. And once you figure out what that process is, you'll succeed. Yeah. But it's intimidating. But don't be scared. Just keep trying. Energizer Bunny, keep going.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Annie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I appreciate it.